I love this story. Woman divorces husband because he supported Donald Trump. How can you not just jump on a story like this, like a dog on a dreamsicle? This is great. You gotta love it. We gotta talk about this. What about in your family, in your household? Is this kind of thing ever an issue? Is there ever kind of a rift between the husband and the wife or family members because of political stuff? Do you ever get kind of an all-in-the-family scenario going in your own house here? Let me give you the number here, 663-1270. Jim Walsh on Super Talk 1270, supertalk1270.com. Been a while, hasn't it? Yeah, I thought I'd sit in today, do an hour of the old talk show thingy there. Got some fun things to talk about, but let me get right to this story here. It's a story from a couple of weeks back, and since I'm on now for the first time since I think the first of the year, I want to jump right on this. I love this. I love this kind of stuff. You know, it amazes me, the things that people choose to get all worked up over. Because, you know, my wife and I, we don't see eye to eye on everything. God knows. Although we do kind of see eye to eye on the Trump thing. Neither of us like the guy. I don't trust the guy. And she doesn't. Well, we have different reasons, though, for not liking him. I don't like him because I used to live and work in Atlantic City, New Jersey, and I heard all about this guy from the locals. The big take in Atlantic City at the time, this was the early 90s. So it's not that drastically, you know, it's not like it was another lifetime necessarily. It's going back a ways. But the take you always heard on Mr. Trump in Atlantic City was the guy was kind of a piker. He was not really the real deal. He was more of a poser. He had a lot of money throwing around, but it was scared money. You know what I mean? He didn't really have the meat and potatoes behind it. He was a wheeler and dealer, and again, I'm just telling you what the take was on the street at the time. He was not the guy with the real money, the real power in Atlantic. You know who was, by the way? In the early 90s, you know who the guy was in Atlantic City who had the real power, the real money, who really, if anybody could be said to own the town, it was not Mr. Trump. It was, you ready for this? Merv Griffin. Ooh. Yeah, well, remember Merv owned several of those casinos in Atlantic City. Merv was the real deal as far as the money was concerned in South Jersey. Trump, not so much. I mean, yeah, he had a couple of his casinos there. He had I remember the Trump Taj Mahal in Atlantic City on the site where the old legendary steel pier used to be. And forgive me while I indulge myself. I'm an East Coast kid, and these memories, if you've lived here all your life, you probably have no idea what I'm talking about. But the steel pier was a very famous pier in Atlantic City in the 1930s, where a lot of the big stars of the time used to hang out back in the days of people like Garbo and Gable and John Barrymore and people like that. You know, all these big stars of the era, they would, if they wanted to go hang out somewhere for the weekend, they would go to places like Atlantic City. It was like a 2-hour drive from New York. And they'd come down there, and the place they would usually go was the Steel Pier. They had the diving bell there, and they had the very famous girl on the diving horse. This girl would sit on the horse, and they would dive down from like 50 feet up into a big pool of water right at the end of the pier by the ocean. I think he made a movie about that a few years ago. But anyway, Steel Pier was there for years, and then in the 60s, it went out of business, and the whole thing went to seed, and eventually they tore up the pier. I think they used it for scrap or something. The pier is no longer there, but on the site of where the pier used to be, where it used to start, is the current site of what they used to call the Trump Taj Mahal. And there was talk for years that Trump wanted to rebuild the Steel Pier. He wanted to reclaim those glory years. Now, it wouldn't be the same, obviously, for a lot of reasons. You know, it's a different era today. And at the time, a lot of people said, well, that's just Donald, talking, his ego talking. And as it turns out, they were kind of right. And as it turns out, that was kind of a typical thing with Donald. was his ego talking. But if you want to talk about the guy with the real money, the guy who really backed things up in Atlantic City at the time, you got to talk Merv. Maybe Merv should be the president if he were not dead. You know what I mean? That'd be kind of cool. Have Merv as president. Zsa Zsa could have been the first lady. Anyway, talking about this because of this story. Woman divorces husband because he supported Donald Trump. And by the way, if you can relate to this, if you got a story along these lines, I'd love to hear it here at 663-1270. Donald Trump's presidency has not only divided the country, it's also divided marriages. Gail McCormick, wasn't she a singer? Didn't she do that version of Baby It's You? Oh, different person. Okay. Well, Gail McCormick, a retired prison guard, left her husband of 22 years after she learned during the primary season that he planned to vote for Mr. Trump. Now, Mrs. McCormick said she just couldn't get past the fact that her husband would vote for this guy. Now, you may be sitting there thinking to yourself, it's not an issue here because everybody likes Trump. That's not true. Everybody doesn't like Trump in this state. I mean, yeah, he got like 60% of the vote, but 60% is not 100% by a long stretch. That means a good 35 to 40% of the people voted for somebody else. My wife and I did. I voted for Hillary, and I voted for Gary Johnson. Yeah, I actually voted in this past election. I don't know why, but I did. And I voted for Gary. Of course, living in North Dakota, it's very easy to know who to vote for because you may be sitting there thinking, well, I should vote for Hillary because there's a chance Hillary will win. And you don't want Trump to win, so you got to vote for Hillary. Well, in North Dakota, of course, we all knew from day one who was going to win. So it makes it real easy. So I said, well, I'm going to vote for the guy I like, who was Gary Johnson at the time. But have you ever had anything like this happen in your own family? It's not something that happens every election because every candidate is not as divisive as this certain fellow has been to so much of the country. You never hear stories of people breaking up because one member or the other voted for, say, Mitt Romney. I'm voting for Mitt. What? You're voting for Mitt? I'm getting a divorce. You don't hear of that. Mitt is just not one of those really super divisive kind of guys. Well, Trump is. So if you got a story like this, I would really enjoy hearing about it and hearing your perspective on this. Number here is 663-1270. And by the way, I've got a couple of related. Well, I want to talk about the Uber and Lyft thing. And basically, I would like to ask you for your feedback on how that's working out for you guys. We have a fellow who works at the station here who was telling me about his experience with Uber, and it's been generally positive. But I want to hear from both sides here, if you've used it or if you're a driver. Let me tell you, I'd probably go with Lyft. Of the two, I seem to recall that I like the Lyft deal better. But either one, really. And I seem to recall that, like I say, I seem to recall that Lyft was better. But if I had a decent car, which I currently don't, I would probably drive for one or the other in my copious amount of free time, which I don't have. Anyway, we'll get to that in just a bit. What about families breaking up because of politics? And who gets the dog? That's another thing we'll get to. Totally out of left field, I know. Jim Walsh on Super Talk 1270, supertalk1270.com. Love to hear from you. I'll be right back.
Currently 35.
News and Views with Joel Heitkamp. Weekdays on Super Talk 1270.
Have you had a rift in your family because of who you voted for? Woman divorces husband because he supported Donald Trump. And the number here is 663-1270. As a talk show host, this Trump guy has been such a blessing for those of us who do what I do for a living. Always something going on with this guy that we can talk about, and that gets people worked up about it. Well, let's be honest here. the approval, and you see a lot of it in this town. I can tell you 3 or 4 times a week, I find myself in a situation where I'm in a room with a bunch of adult white males, and they're crowing over what a great guy this Trump is compared to his predecessor. But it's not universal by any means. I don't like the guy. I don't trust him. I never have. I didn't trust him when he was a Democrat back in the day. But the point is that he's one of these guys who is so divisive. Families are actually breaking up because of this. Because the one partner votes for Trump and the other partner votes for somebody else, and they decide for whatever reason they can't live together. Now, that to me seems kind of ridiculous. If you've got nothing better to hold your marriage together than who you vote for, there's something seriously wrong there from day one. But I'd love to hear from you about it if this has been an issue in your family. Hey, my wife votes for so-and-so. Yeah, I love those stories. 663-1270. We'll call it our political edition of Can This Marriage Be Saved? 663-1270. It's Super Talk 1270 and supertalk1270.com. My name is Jim Walsh. You know who you are. Yeah, you do. You know who you are. And what about the Uber and Lyft thing? How's that working out for you guys? Also, we got a new taxi service in town. It just seems like overnight in the last couple of weeks, a blink of an eye, we've gone from having 1.5 taxi services in Bismarck, Mandan, to having, you got the 2 that were here. The 1.5, I like to say, because, one is kind of, You got the one big one, the one semi-big one. And now you've got this third one, the mid-state, whatever they called it. I saw a couple of these guys over at Walmart the other day. They're kind of sitting there in the parking lot, I guess, waiting for business. Mid-state transit or whatever it is. And now, of course, you've got Uber and Lyft. And they just both kind of popped up at the same time. Apparently, they're like Home Depot and Lowe's, where one comes up, the other one is right behind it. Sometimes right next to each other. But I've got a friend here who I'd like to hear about your experiences with this, how it's working out for you so far in this town. Again, 663-1270. So we've got that on the table as well. How does this work out with Uber and the taxi drivers? The Simpsons, and I'm not a big Simpsons fan anymore. I hardly ever watch the show. It's just kind of there. It's one of those things just kind of there. But I caught an episode a couple of months ago where Homer became a driver for one of these new services. And there was a scene where he was getting beat up by a bunch of taxi drivers. Now, I'm not saying that would happen. Not here, anyway. Maybe in some big union town somewhere. Hey, there's an Uber guy. Let's beat him up. Union label. Obviously, that was just a thing he did on a comedy TV show, I hope. But how's it working for you? And again, the perspective. Now, we got a guy who works here at the station who is he's not a driver. He's a passenger. He uses one service or the other. And he says so far it's been pretty good for him. He's got the app on his smartphone. And he says all you do basically is click on it and say, I need a ride. And you tell them where they are, or they get it through the GPS thing there. And a few minutes later, a guy pulls up in the car. My understanding is the car has to be 2000 or newer. The year model has to be from 2000 or newer, and it has to be a 4-door. And I can't do it because I'm currently driving an older car. Our car died. We had an Oldsmobile. It died a few months ago. So we had to grab a car in a hurry. So we got this. It's like a stopgap car. We got an old Pontiac Bonneville and it runs fine. I mean, we got it fixed up and everything, but it runs fine. But it's from like 1993. So it's got like 200,000 miles on it. It's a decent little car, but it's a stopgap. It's not something we're going to have long term. Eventually, when we get our ducks in a row financially, we're going to get a newer car, and this one we'll either give it away or sell it, or my wife will give it to her son or whatever, or we'll just keep it as like a backup car. When one of us has a car, the other one has to do something. But the point is, if I had a decent car, I'd probably be doing the Uber Lyft thing in my free time right now. From what I hear, it's a pretty good deal. The one thing you think about when you talk about this, and it came up a few years ago when I was between radio jobs, and I was thinking of driving a taxi for a while. The safety issue. Now, I have not heard too many horror stories, haven't heard any really, about people getting attacked while driving an Uber or Lyft service. Not yet, anyway. But basically, I'm just putting it out there just to see what kind of response people are getting from these new services, how it's working for you as a rider or as a driver. And the number 663-1270, there's still a lot of towns where they don't have it because, for example, certain towns where the taxi drivers are organized and they manage to keep the service out of their town because they don't want the competition, which hardly seems fair to me, but that's the way the world works in some places. In Denmark, this just came over today, Uber is pulling out of Denmark because of a new taxi regulation there that they say they can't compete with. And you always thought regulations favored the little guy. No, they don't. Not always, anyway. Uber says it's going to pull out of Denmark next month, mid-April, after the government agreed a new taxi law introducing additional requirements such as mandatory fare meters and seat sensors, none of which are really necessary, but it's just basically a convenient way of keeping these guys out of the market so they don't compete with the guys who have the political pull. But far be it from me to be cynical about any of that. Traditional cabs, obviously already kitted out with the required tech. Uber service relies on drivers using their own vehicles as taxis or jitneys or whatever you want to call them, using smartphones as meters. So it would be harder for the company to comply. I mean, it's pretty blatant, I think, what's going on here. Now, Uber had previously vowed to stay and fight the proposals when they were presented to Parliament last month. We're talking about in Denmark now. So it's entirely possible. It's hoping that announcing the withdrawal now will apply some last-minute pressure that some regulators will say, "Oh, they're pulling out. Well, we don't want them to do that." If that's what they're counting on, so far it ain't working. An Uber spokesman said in order for the company to operate in the market, the proposed regulations need to change. Uber will continue to work with the government. I guess they're doing some wheeling and dealing of their own in this case. So, it's far from universal, the Uber thing, or the Lyft. But it is here at Bismarck now. And I'd be curious to hear how it's working out for you, just on your own individual level. How is the service? I mean, if you've had sucky service, tell me. I don't care. I want to know the truth. I want to know how it's working out for people. I've worked at radio stations where they say, "Oh, don't say anything bad about these people. We want to get them as sponsors." Fortunately, that has not been an issue here. I was actually fired from a radio station once for that. I went into a hardware store in this town where I was working at the time, and the service was horrible. So I went on the air, and I called them on it. Turns out they were a sponsor of the station. They bought commercial time. Didn't buy much, but they bought something. It was like $400 a month, which in radio is peanuts, or it was at the time. And they used that as an excuse to fire me. I think they were just trying to get rid of me anyway, because I hit a few raw nerves, because I wasn't conservative enough. Some of these stations, it's not about being entertaining. It's about being conservative. You got to be conservative. It's a very conservative area. Yup. Yeah, right. But The point is, that's not really an issue for me here. We can call people on this stuff. And if you've used one of these services and it hasn't worked out for you, I'd kind of like to hear about that too. Either way, let me know. Let's talk about it here. Number 663-1270. Your comments welcome online as well. 663-1270 and Supertalk 1270, supertalk1270.com. Coming up, we have an update on the story about that student who died a couple of years ago. He was what they call a confidential informant for the police after he got caught on a hot bust. And the parents of this young man spoke before some committee in town here last week. And I want to do an update on that story. Also, we'll talk about inequity in life. I'll explain in just a few minutes here why life is not fair at Super Talk 1270.
Currently 35.
The Red River Farm Network. Ag News is here on Super Talk 1270.
I want to follow up on a story. The original story is a couple of years old about this student who became a confidential informant, and he died. He was killed, and the police were stonewalling on, it was suicide. Yeah, worst case of suicide we've ever seen. Yeah, right. Sure it was. Tell me this kid didn't get screwed royally. He had a little pot, and they busted him because he was going to sell it to somebody, and they said, well, we'll make you a deal. We'll make you a confidential informant. Now, don't go talking to any lawyers or anything. Yeah, don't go talking to your parents, We'll make you a confidential informant, and we'll let you off the hook. Because drugs are bad, okay? And unfortunately, sometime later, he disappeared, and after that, they found his body in the Red River, weighed down with rocks. He was shot in the head. And they said, it must be a suicide. Somebody actually said, it must be a suicide because drugs are bad. You see, people, number here is 663-1270. You see, people hate when I do stories like this because there's a lot of people in this town who would really rather I stick to the same old, the old puff pieces about how great it is to live in North Dakota. Yep. Nothing wrong here. Everything's just perfect here. Yep. Well, I guess so. If you're white and male and over 65, native-born North Dakota, everything probably is great for you here. And you probably don't want to screw that up by a bunch of other non-white, non-male, non-native-born North Dakotan people talking about their rights as citizens in America. Oh, we can't have that now, can we? No, you're not a good old boy. You're not a good old boy. We don't want to hear about it. You think they'd be just too busy trying to, figure out new ways to screw over the Indians, like that clown over in the state capitol there. Hi, Al. How you doing? Yeah, right. Not a big fan of those people either. A testimony by the parents of the North Dakota college student killed while serving as a confidential informant has re-sparked conversation about the usefulness of such programs. Tammy Sadek spoke before a state Senate committee last week about her son, Andrew. Andrew had been recruited, I'm making little quotation marks with my fingers around recruited by police to be an informant after he was arrested for trafficking a small amount of marijuana. Of course, we all know there's nothing worse in the world than doing drugs, right? Well, he disappeared in May of 2014. His body was, and I'm not making a joke here. I mean, I'm pissed. I mean, this is a story that should make you mad. His body was found in the Red River that summer. The autopsy revealed he had a gunshot wound to the head, and his backpack was weighed down with rocks. And they said, well, obviously it was a suicide. Must have been all those drugs. See, we blame it on the drugs, yeah, and all the people buying the drugs, yeah. But Mrs. Sadek, now, what she did say, I don't think she went as far as saying that this whole confidential informant thing is just a waste of everybody's time and an unnecessary risk to people's lives. She didn't quite go as far as to say we shouldn't have the program. What she did say was, as I understand, was potential informants should be, at the very least, better informed of their legal options and should be made to understand the risks they may be taking. The father also spoke before the committee. Now, we have a story. We did not produce it, but there's a great podcast that the folks at Reason Magazine put together. And we have it on our website. We have a link to it. We have a story about the whole reopening of this sad saga. And the website of Reason Magazine, it's a current events publication out of California. They produced a podcast about this. They put it out in 2015, calling it, we're quoting here, a story of overzealous prosecution of minor drug offenses by a task force answerable only to itself, callous official indifference toward a grieving family, and a lack of transparency by authorities that raises more questions than it answers. Amen. And a radio station in Valley City also did a story about it. They did report that there was a bill that passed the House last month that would establish new guidelines for use of confidential informants. Well, that's a step in the right direction if it goes through. Now, we got a whole bunch of links to different articles on this subject. The main one I urge you to look at is the podcast from Reason. It's a 10-minute podcast, and it's very well produced, very well put together, and we have it on the website. You can see it for yourself. supertalk1270.com. We've had it last couple of days. If you go to the website, if you've never been there, we have a bunch of stories there. We have kind of like a marquee thing that goes across the screen and shows the top stories. Like right now, it's got the story about the railroad bridge. They're going to rebuild the railroad bridge, and a couple of stories like that. It's got some stuff there about the NCAA, the Final Four, and all that. Well, we've had it there, and I'll keep it there for another day in that little marquee thing. So it'll be very easy for you to access, but I would urge you in the strongest possible terms to take a look at this story if you haven't heard about it, if you haven't talked about it in a while, and just see what all the hubbub is about. It's a story that will really put a burr in your saddle. It did in mine when it happened, and when this whole thing happened last week with the testimony and kind of reopened the old wounds. But I would sincerely urge you in the strongest terms to read up on this story and how it was handled, or should I say mishandled, by the authorities, and how the parents and this boy's family were really left out to dry, just, flapping in the breeze, so to speak, by the authorities. I mean, this is the mentality of the whole war on drug things. The kid was caught with a little bit of pot. Ultimately, he paid for it with his life. And, there are going to be people who say, well, it's not the fault of the authorities. It's the fault of the people who buy all the drugs. Oh, shut up. Bull squeeze, fella. Bottom line is, this young man, this boy, really, was put in an unnecessarily dangerous situation. And for what? He had a little bit of weed on him. Come on. Inexcusable. All right. But anyway, that story is up on the website, and I do hope you'll take a look at it and decide for yourself. Get your own feelings about it, and then, of course, we would welcome your feedback on the site. supertalk1270.com. What else do we have? I wanted to talk a weird subject, and we'll get to this in the next break here, about the inequity in life and about how everything I know about life I learned from playing blackjack. This is just one of those weird things that popped into my head. We're getting around to the time of year we're starting to think about graduations. This time a year ago, I was getting ready to get my master's degree. Oh, it's done me a hell of a lot of good. But nonetheless, I'm glad I got it. I got it from Mary, great school. And the commencement was in May. And, a year later, if you put a gun to my head and asked me who the commencement speaker was, I couldn't tell you. I think it was some lady judge or something. But maybe you're there. Maybe you could tell me. I don't remember. All I remember is just sitting there in this cap and gown, and it was a hot, sweaty day, and I'm sitting there in that hot arena, and my wife is sitting up, and all I'm thinking about is I just want to get out of this cap and gown and into a nice cold margarita when this thing is over with. But there I go being cynical again. Anyway, we'll talk about that. I understand Shailene, what's her name, the actress? I keep calling her Woody. No. Freudian slip there. No, Shailene Woodley, she cut a plea deal after being arrested for involvement in the pipeline protest. And where did that get everybody? Well, we know. Yeah. Oh, boy. What else? The heir to the Red Bull fortune is enjoying a jet-set life 4 years after he ran over a cop and killed him. Lovely! Yeah! All men are created equal, but some of us are more equal than others. And then a story, if we had more time today, maybe we should devote this for another show. This is always a fun thing to do a couple of times a year, is talk about, we get new restaurants in the Bismarck, Mandan area, and it's always fun to talk about the restaurants that aren't in North Dakota but should be. The Fargo Rag, the Fargo Forum, the nearest thing we have to a real newspaper in this state, they did this story, it was in yesterday, about these restaurants, Cheesecake Factory, somebody mentioned Chick-fil-A, In-N-Out Burger, Whataburger, Del Taco, P.F. Chang's, a Chinese franchise, and all these places. Somebody mentioned the Waffle House. Okay, well, whatever. Ruth's Chris Steakhouse, with the most unpronounceable name in America, but and some of these other places that are not in North Dakota yet, but should be. And if we have time, we'll touch upon that. If not, we'll save it for another day, because that's always a fun thing to talk about. All right, I want to talk about inequity in life. Now, let me tell you why I'm doing this. No particular reason. I just kind of woke up this morning with this on my mind. I think I must have been dreaming about it. You have dreams sometimes where you have these conversations, and then you wake up and you're thinking about it all day for some reason. And I think I had a dream last night where I was talking with somebody in the dream about inequity in life and unfairness in life. It occurred to me that everything I think you need to know about life you can learn playing blackjack. Now, let me explain here. All right. Jim Walsh at Supertalk 1270 and supertalk1270.com. We're getting around the time of the year for graduations, where college students, high school students, some cases junior high students preparing for the cap and gown ceremonies. I don't know. Why would you have a cap and gown ceremony for a kid in the 8th grade? He doesn't care, and really it's not that big a deal. Well, the parents, we are a little done, he graduated 8th grade. I mean, come on, you can only lower the bar so far, you know what I mean? Getting ridiculous, like being the valedictorian of summer school. Come on. But for students who are graduating, and I was among you not so long ago, I went back to school late in life and got a college degree, got a bachelor's a couple of years ago, got my master's last year in business. I once couldn't spell business administrator, now I are one. But it occurred to me that, you need to talk to people about the inequities of life, the unfairness of life. Now, life is not unfair, but life is definitely not fair. You know what I mean? I don't think the universe tries to be unfair. The universe is not out to do you over, to do a number on you, but I think it's equally important that you realize that the universe is not going to cut you any favors either. It just is. And if you fall on the wrong side of the luck thing, it's out you go. It's natural selection. The universe has certain basic laws, and if you violate one of those laws, even by accident, out you go. You're no longer part of the gene pool. And a couple of stories came up that really drove this home. I started, when I got to work today, I did a little Googling. And then after I was done Googling, I got on the computer. Whole life's a rim shot. Anyway, I came across a couple of stories here, which at the moment I cannot find to save the life of me. Well, one of them was about cancer, and we're not making a joke about cancer, obviously. Although cancer can be hilarious. But, here it is. Okay, a story here from the Los Angeles Times, the LA Times. Somebody did some research regarding cancer, about the biggest factors in getting cancer. And they found the number one factor is in whether you're going to develop cancer, let alone survive it or not. I mean, you would think smoking. Well, obviously that is a big factor, and certain types of behavior. Certain types of food, presumably you would eat, that might put you at a higher risk than others. But the single biggest factor, and it's really it really applies to life in general, how long you're going to live, genetics, DNA, your genes. In other words, bad luck. You just happen to have something in your DNA that makes you susceptible to this cell mutation that we call cancer. Bad luck. An analysis of patients from 69 countries makes the case that most, 2/3 of all cancer mutations, in other words, 2/3 of all the cases of cancer, arise from random genetic endowments. In other words, you just had the bad luck to be born with the wrong thing in your genes that made you susceptible to cancer. Now, the way I relate that to blackjack is, you're playing blackjack, and you get a certain hand, and the dealer has a certain hand, and you're supposed to act accordingly. Like, what is it they tell you? You always split your eights, you always split your aces, you never split your tens, and by the way, you never play at a table with a guy who does split their tens. You'll screw everything up. But if you get, say, a 14 and the dealer shows a 6, conventional wisdom in blackjack strategy says you will not hit that card. You will stand on that card. If you're showing a soft 16 or less and you stand on it, you are what the folks in the gambling industry call a sheep waiting to be fleeced. You see what I'm saying here? There's always inequity in life. I'm certainly not the first. But see, this is what I would tell the graduating class if I were ever invited to speak. I understand TEDx is in town tonight. I love the TEDx thing. I probably won't be there this time, but I love that stuff. I just love to hear people talking about how the world works. Even if they're wrong, you learn something because they're smart people. But, there's always inequity in life. It's like in war, probably the most unfair, unequal thing of all. Some people get killed in the war. Some people get wounded in the war. Some people will walk through the worst battles in the history of humankind, come out without a scratch, and then they'll come home and they'll get mowed down by a car 3 days after they get home. It's kind of what happened to Patton when you think about it. Very close to it, almost exactly what happened to Patton. But life is, some people never leave the country. Some are stationed in the Antarctic, and some are stationed in San Francisco. Life is, as JFK would say, life is unfair. Some of us are born Kennedys. Some aren't. You see it a lot in show business. I see it in radio, for that matter. I know guys in my line of work who... I've known people who never had any intention of doing radio for a living, and they just kind of stumbled into it one day. They just decided maybe as a hobby or just on the lark, they would stop at the local radio station and see if they could get a job doing that. Just strictly on the lark. Didn't give it any more thought than I'm giving it to you right now. And they walk in, they get a job, and the next thing you know, they're big stars in the industry. It happens. I know guys who have suffered and sacrificed their whole lives in this industry to make something of themselves, became dedicated broadcasters, and they've gone absolutely nowhere. Some of them have died paupers. A lot of guys I started out with in the business are not around anymore. They died young, largely because of what happened to them in the radio business. That and, of course, bad luck. And the point is, life is really not fair. But again, you can kind of read the cards and act accordingly. You can do things to stack the deck in your favor. Let me give you an example here. A very extreme, obvious example. If you've ever entertained serious notions of being a movie star. Now, I would never say people shouldn't follow their dreams. But let's face it, if you're a 40-year-old pig farmer living in Dubuque, Iowa, I'm not going to say it's impossible to be big in pictures, but it's extremely unlikely at your age it's going to happen. You're probably not going to be giving George Clooney a run for his money anytime in the future. It's probably not going to happen. In fact, as far as acting is concerned, from what I've seen, if you don't already have a foot in the door of the business, the Hollywood industry, if you don't already have a hand in it by the time you're out of high school, you're probably not going to make it. You're probably not going to get to a point where you maybe get to a point where you can make a little bit of extra money here and there as an extra in some movie. I've done that. But you're not going to be a big-time movie star. Oh, again, to wrap it all up here, because we're running short on time, the point is, you take the cards you're dealt, you take the cards you're played, and you act on them accordingly. That's really the best thing you can do. And that's it. Now go forth, young graduates, and stumble around and just do the best you can with what you got and try not to get killed. And good luck with the cancer thing. That's it. Your comments welcome. SuperTalk1270.com. I'm Jim Walsh. Later.